Well, thank you all for coming today. On behalf of Peter Bergen, the Director of the National Security Studies Program, and Steve Cole, the President of New America, I want to thank you all for coming today. Very quickly, not only for us here, but for those who are on our webcast, we could have everyone in the audience take your cell phones now, turn them fully off for the purposes of the sound system, not just put them on vibrate, so that we have no interruptions during the program. I'm Doug Ollivant. I'm a senior fellow here at New America Foundation. It's my pleasure to introduce today Miss Lucy Morgan Edwards. She's the author of The Afghan Solution, the inside story of Abdul Haq, the CIA, and how Western hubris lost Afghanistan. A very provocative title. She's the former political advisor to the EU ambassador in Kabul with responsibility for civil military affairs, narcotics, and security sector reform. During her 7 years in the region, she worked for the UN in Kandahar at the height of the Taliban regime. So she has experience in both pre- and post-2001 Afghanistan. She worked as an election monitor at the 2002 Emergency Loyal Jirga, was an initial researcher on transitional justice issues for the International Crisis Group, ICG, and a monitor on the currency exchange project with the Afghan Central Bank, and a correspondent for the for the Economist and the Daily Telegraph. So a wide range of experiences in the region. Her ultimate job in Afghanistan was in 2005 as a country expert to the EU monitors of the 2005 Afghan parliamentary elections. We look forward to hearing about her book today. Lucy, please come up.
Thank you, Doug, for the introduction, and to the New America Foundation for letting me come here today to talk to you. Let me just figure out how this slide thing works. I think it's forward like that. I'm just giving a bit of context on the book, really. This is a picture of me in Kandahar when I was first there in the year 2000. I was there working on community development and water projects. When I say community development, the projects were very much bottom-up and involved directing aid through community forums that the UN had been working with in urban areas, which later became known as the National Solidarity Program. I thank you, Doug, for the introduction. I did a wide range of jobs. I had to actually leave Kandahar when the USS Cole was bombed in, was it August or October? It was October 2000. And I went back to the UK and returned to the region a year later after September 11th. And did those jobs. I'm not going to list them again. But basically, my experience in Afghanistan changed in 2002 when I met the Arsala family. Then I was given access to a very different side of Afghanistan to what most of the foreigners experienced, living in compounds and being embedded with the military. The Arsala family was a family of tribal elders who come from Jalalabad in the east of the country. And they were well known during the jihad because they were a family of 7 brothers, including Hajiddin Muhammad, Haji Qadir, and Abdul Haq. And they'd been commanders during the anti-Soviet jihad. I stayed in Afghanistan when the focus turned to Iraq, working as a freelance journalist and on the currency exchange, et cetera, et cetera. And my book deals not only with the Abdul Haq plan, but with the first 5 years of the war, because just when everyone else left, I felt that I witnessed quite a lot of turning points, particularly in the political side of the intervention, that have contributed, I believe, to the current situation that we face today in Afghanistan. I'm just going to show you how we're going to structure the talk here. So I'm just looking at where we are today in Afghanistan, how we got there. I have a piece on state building in the current International Review of the Red Cross publication, Conflict in Afghanistan, which is just coming out, although it's the December 2010 edition. I don't want to go into too much depth about how we got there in terms of military strategy chosen, et cetera, because I'm sure a lot of you have examined that or have read about that in the press. But that is also in my paper in the International Review of the Red Cross. I'm going to talk about what was the alternative to the military campaign that we undertook in October 2001, which is the Abdul Haq plan. I'm going to talk about why it was ignored and why it's important, why I believe it's important that we understand what it was and what is its relevance for today. So let's look at today in Afghanistan. Security situation. I think the bold attacks last week in Kabul, the suicide bombing on Darulaman Avenue, and last month on the US Embassy illustrate the difficulty for the US and other NATO countries in Afghanistan today. We're told that it's most likely to have been the Haqqani network. Generally, security seems to be getting worse across the country, with IED attacks, etc., up year on year, and the government finding it very difficult to hold areas outside of Kabul. The cost for the US alone has exceeded $500 billion US. In terms of military progress, the ongoing justification is dismantling, disrupting, and defeating al-Qaeda. But the metrics of success have been very much about numbers of al-Qaeda and Taliban killed, especially as the military has moved away from a coin approach and towards capture and kill, which has had deleterious side effects, particularly politically. We've also tried to weld an Occidental-style nation-state onto an essentially tribal society. Yet the government has a highly centralized administration, barely operating in the regions, and which includes characters who perhaps have little interest in pursuing the kind of stability and reconciliation desired by the West. And last point is that the military strategy seems to have occurred entirely separately to what was going on politically. In terms of the West's exit, much of this is predicated on the idea of build-up of Afghan national security forces. However, this lacks a clear political strategy and is very, very expensive. For example, the Pentagon spent something like $39 billion US over the last 6 years building up Afghan national security forces. And though the cost is projected to reduce from $13 billion a year to $6 billion a year by 2014, we have to remember that the government in Kabul raises only $2 billion a year in taxes. So I feel that the Afghan National Security Force approach to exit is really a zero-sum game, and it seems to be the West's main focus. We don't seem to be looking at other options. In the year 2010, US General Flynn said, 8 years into the war in Afghanistan, our vast intelligence apparatus is unable to answer fundamental questions about the environment in which US and allied forces operate and the people they seek to persuade. Taliban reconciliation, well, I think the events of the last couple of weeks have indicated that, as well as the assassination of Rabbani last month, has shown that this is not really going to happen anytime soon. The reconciliation also took off very, very late because of the U.S. Desire not to have a reconciliation process. And it's also very hard, I think, to start this type of process when you're still fighting a war. It's very contradictory. So why my interest in Abdul Haq? Ironically, Abdul Haq is a household name in Afghanistan, yet his name remains virtually unknown in the West, possibly except among a few people who were dealing with the Cold War, particularly here in Washington, D.C. However, he's pretty unknown. When I talk to most people, they're kind of like, why are you writing about this guy? This seems to be a very esoteric subject. But when I talk to most Afghans, particularly the slightly older generation, they know immediately who one's talking about. Abdul Haq was from a leading family of Gulzai Pashtun. He was one of 7 brothers known as resistance royalty during the 1980s jihad. The family were based in the east and worked with the Hizb Islami party of Yunus Khalis during the 1980s to eject the Soviets. Other commanders in the party at the time included extremist commanders Hikmat Shah and Jalaluddin Haqqani. Abdul Haq, who was a moderate, was the only Pashtun commander of any significance who eventually took the fight to the city, to Kabul, to the center of the regime, which is where he realized that he needed to attack in order to put pressure on the Soviet regime. In Kabul, he was well known for his strategically excellent asymmetric operations, which included blowing a 7-story underground Soviet munitions dump at Karga, which is an event that some said turned the war. Despite this, he was relentlessly criticized by both the ISI and the CIA, who dubbed him Hollywood Hack, and failed to provide him with the munitions he needed. He left Afghanistan after the fall of the communist government in '92, when different mujahideen factions turned on one another. I first became interested in Abdul Haq actually after I left Afghanistan, my first visit, and after 9/11, when I saw, you won't be able to read this, but just to give you an idea, I saw this article in the London Evening Standard, and there was this commander, Abdul Haq, asking for the West not to bomb Afghanistan. And he was saying, Tony Blair, you have to put the hand of restraint on George Bush not to bomb Afghanistan, because I have a plan, and if you bomb, it's going to scupper that, essentially. So the plan, very few people realize that this was an alternative to what unfolded after September 11th and thereafter in the last decade over Afghanistan, in Afghanistan. Abdul Haq's plan was an internal solution. It was an Afghan alternative to the Taliban. And to assess this, I interviewed many of Haq's former commanders, other tribal leaders, senior Taliban, members of the King's Group, and lastly, 2 independent and private British and US efforts trying to get support for Abdul Haq and the ex-king with whom he was doing the plan, via US and British government agencies, particularly the intelligence agency, the White House, and various agencies in Whitehall in London. It's through the lens of those twin efforts that my book examines the intelligence failures of both the US and UK government policy since 9/11 and around the weeks of 9/11 as well. So what was this plan? So Abdul Haq believed that Afghans needed to have an alternative to the Taliban. He knew that the regime was becoming unpopular, and in the 2 years before 9/11, I would say 3 years actually, 2 to 3 years before 9/11, he held meetings in Rome. Well, there was the Rome process with the ex-king. Abdul Haq became the commander of this group. There were other meetings held in Istanbul and also in Bonn, attended by tribal leaders, by Haq's former commanders during the jihad and the Taliban. The ex-king would be the rallying point around which disparate groups would coalesce. The plan depended on the Taliban collapsing from within, and by January 2001, Haq believed the regime was sufficiently unpopular to implode, that it was like a crystal which could be fissured and shatter at any time, at the right time. And he felt that by January 2001 that the time was right. The idea of the plan was to call upon and work with those members of the Taliban fed up with the regime. He did deals. He was meeting not just in Istanbul and Bonn, but in Dubai. He was meeting with moderate Taliban, many of whom had been his commanders during the jihad during the 1980s. These were men he could call upon and who had a level of trust with him. Many of them had become Taliban during the mid-90s when they saw the regime as a means of bringing stability. And some of these guys, by this stage, were actually even providing the bodyguard to Mullah Omar, some of Mullah Malang's commanders, he was one of Haq's men. Many of his allies were embedded in the Taliban, in key positions of the Taliban military axis of Jalalabad, Gardez, Ghazni, and Kabul. But an essential element of the plan was that he wasn't trying to do deals with the extremists. He recognized the stratified nature of the regime, and he was targeting those moderates that he knew, people with whom he had worked during the 1980s. He was against the bombing because he knew that his points of reference, the moderates he'd worked with or commanded, would disperse, leaving the extremists manning the guns. Now, if you bomb a country, everything changes overnight. Unfortunately, the West not only failed to understand the stratified nature of the regime and was sort of lumping everyone together, the good guys and the bad guys. They really failed to understand that the Arabs and the hardliners were a slim minority, and many were decent Afghan nationalists. Abdul Haq also knew that bombing Taliban front lines would enable the Northern Alliance to take Kabul essentially alone and with no Pashtun bolster to the south and east. This would make way for the lopsided political settlement that in fact has taken place and enabled the Northern Alliance to take the key power ministries back in 2001 and has contributed to the alienation that most Pashtuns have felt from the state. Sadly, as we all know, Haq's warnings about the bombing campaign were ignored. John Gunston, who was one of the British trying to get support for Abdul Haq, and who went to visit him in Rome immediately after 9/11, where he met with the various commanders, and then went to Peshawar before Haq went in on his last mission, said to me, "It's crazy, you have this today, yet in Rome you had Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbek and Hazara leaders all ready to buy into the Haq strategy." What he was talking about, he said, it's crazy you have this Panjshiri nonsense today, and you had all these other groups who were willing to buy in to provide a more equal settlement. This is the Taliban Deputy Interior Minister, who was actually assassinated in 2006, sadly. But he was one of the people who was wanting to bring some of his units over to Abdul Haq's side. And he told me, when I interviewed him in 2004, he said a lot of people supported his plan, even in Paktia, Khost, Gardez, and throughout Afghanistan. And when I asked him actually why the Taliban had executed Abdul Haq so quickly, because of course he had gone in on his mission in October 2001 after the bombing started and was captured very quickly in the southeast and executed, and possibly tipped off by ISI to the Taliban. When I asked him why he was executed so quickly by his boss, actually, Mullah Razak, he said because if they had imprisoned him, he would have provided a rallying point for a revolution. And in my opinion, he'd be president of Afghanistan today. But actually, I mean, my interest is not who's going to be president or who's not going to be president. It wasn't so much about a power struggle for that. It was really about the kind of structure that Abdul Haq envisaged politically. That's my interest. As I said, much of my investigation was through these two groups of Westerners, the Ritchie brothers in the US, who were lobbying for Abdul Haq and his plan way before 9/11. These two guys were signed-up Republicans. They were Chicago options traders who'd made a lot of money, and they'd been partly brought up in Afghanistan. And in fact, they still run NGO projects there in Jalalabad. And for those 2 years prior to 9/11, they had been working hard. They had helped to finance some of the meetings in Istanbul and in Bonn, and were wanting to provide logistical support in terms of sat phones and vehicles when Abdul Haq started his rebellion in the east. They'd also been lobbying a lot with Bud McFarlane here in Washington, D.C., and in fact were due to have a meeting on the morning of 9/11. They thought that despite the fact they hadn't been able to rally much interest prior to 9/11, that when 9/11 happened, that this would change and people would become interested. And they talk about Joe Ritchie talks about a platter. I couldn't imagine a platter more ideally loaded, he said, talking about Abdul Haq, about a solution that didn't require US military involvement, had already been worked out, was fairly equal, and was there for the taking, basically. So why was this important? Now, this is a great photograph. I don't know if you know who this guy is with the henna-colored beard. That's Jalaluddin Haqqani and Abdul Haq in 1991, when Abdul Haq had organized the Shura of the Commanders in Badakhshan just before the fall of Kabul from President Najibullah's communist regime. And Abdul Haq was bringing together these various commanders of different Mujahideen factions to discuss how they were going to have a sort of handover or transfer of security in Kabul, and to make an agreement between the various sides, which unfortunately Massoud apparently broke because he went into Kabul too quickly, trying to stave off Hikmatyar, who was coming from the other direction. But Jalaluddin Haqqani trusted Abdul Haq. He had trained him in guerrilla warfare techniques in the early 1980s. And of course, they were part of the Hizb Islami, the same party. And he comes from the Zadran tribe. I mean, obviously, we're reading about these guys every day in the newspapers now. But this was a tribe that was very pro the monarchy, very conservative, and very against any form of foreign intervention. And they were key commanders in the 1980s against the Soviets, and are now providing a lot of the problems that the US and NATO are facing today cross-border in the AFPAC region. But I believe that that if there was any way that Haqqani was going to come in, it would have been with Abdul Haq's plan. And unfortunately, when Abdul Haq was killed, Haqqani then, he met with the ISI in Islamabad, and possibly since then he has been, as we're reading, working with the ISI, working semi-independently, when no one's quite sure exactly to what degree they're autonomous. But the plan was the ultimate Taliban reconciliation. The ex-king was needed for unity. He was needed symbolically to bring the structure. He was just going to be there in a transitional phase, though. It wasn't intended to restore the monarchy necessarily, but Abdul Haq wanted him to be there, at least during that transitional period, to bring the groups together. And even General Massoud, or Commander Massoud, had agreed to this. And I'm just reading from my book here. At a historic meeting in Hoja Bauddin, Dushanbe, in July 2001, this Pashtun hero of the war met with Commander Massoud, otherwise known as the Tajik hero of the war, and they came to a mutually acceptable agreement. Above all else, Haq desired a united Afghanistan. Okay, so this was also, of course, going to be an internal solution that not only would have obviated the need for a Western military adventure, but actually depended on the absence of the Western bombing campaign. It recognized the stratified nature of support for the Taliban and took advantage of that. It was also our best chance of bringing on board the Haqqanis, and it was the kind of agreement made over tea and nuts the night before the so-called battle that relied on more traditional internal legitimacy. So why did the West not support this plan? As I've said, I'm not going into detail about what we did instead. You can read about that in the paper in the December 2010 edition of the International Review of the Red Cross. I can give you references later on that. But basically, the West seemed to prefer the short-term policy of using the Northern Alliance as a proxy, failing to recognize it was thus taking sides in an ongoing civil war. Neither the Northern Alliance nor the US, except for Massoud possibly, but elements of the Shura Nazar after 9/11, neither of them wanted the king back, yet he was to be there only in a transitional phase, ensuring buy-in from all groups and that the right structure could be in place. The last reason was Pakistan. This went back to the 1980s, and the ISI had never enjoyed Haq's criticism of their policy of favoring the most extremist of the Mujahideen leaders like Hekmatyar and Saif when it came to handing out some of the US war chest during the 1980s. This is something that Abdul Haq had been very candid in his criticism about. Although ironically, Haq was not a Pashtun nationalist seeking to renegotiate the Durand Agreement, which is something that the ISI and Pakistan has been very nervous about since the 1970s. So, it seems that ISI belittled him, and the CIA agents who were there during the 1980s kind of took their cue from that. Let's see. Okay, I'm just going to... John, can you just go back? It's a bit hard to go back the slides. So what are the ways forward? In 2001, Afghanistan was a failed state. It pretty much still is today. What's going? Okay, he's coming there. When dealing with state failure, we need to think more long term. In such instances, a bombing campaign is not necessarily helpful. We need to understand the divisions within Afghan society which remain as relevant today as during the communist period. For example, the urban modernizers versus the more tribal elements, the rural people. The West needs to understand and work more with traditional legitimacy in tribal countries, not just with ideas of capacity building and the Westphalian nation-state model. For example, for this to work, another issue to take account of is that Abdul Haq had advocated that the strongmen and Taliban who had committed rights abuses during earlier phases of the conflict should be held to account. The West failed to do this and instead has midwifed a culture of impunity since 9/11 in Afghanistan. I mean, you'll notice that in other interventions, like in the Balkans and in Sierra Leone, there was always a process of, call it truth and reconciliation or justice. But we haven't had that. We haven't supported that at all since 9/11. There are lots of what ifs. But certainly the situation in Afghanistan today is far more complex than it was in 2001. I believe Abdul Haq foresaw the chaos that would unfold if the West set out on the path it has. This is why he went in, some say prematurely, on his mission, and why he was concerned with getting the right structure in place before he died, i.e. an internal peace plan based on agreements between the various groups. A plan that would not put Afghanistan on a collision course between internal and external sources of legitimacy. I believe what he tried to achieve would have avoided the need for a Western-style military intervention and enabled Afghan-style governance to take root instead of the corruption we have seen associated with military aid and spending. The West also needs to understand better the context of fragile societies before engaging with them, particularly in relation to traditional forms of legitimacy and customary arrangements in expanding the reach, power, and effectiveness of the state. To date, we have just dismissed such arrangements as too complex. The Taliban have understood the relevance of such arrangements and made use of them. Only this type of customary governance will secure space in Afghanistan in the longer term, not military occupation, the buying off of regional strongmen, and bolstering these militias that we're doing in the regions at the moment. And I believe that this has relevance for the Arab Spring, that we need to understand our failures, our mistakes in Afghanistan before we start heading headlong into some of these other fragile societies in the Middle East. So that's my little introduction. If you've got any questions.
Thanks very much. Let's see, can we get the slides off, please? All right, well, let's thank you very much for that presentation, which is very provocative. Let me start by asking you what you mean by the Western consensus. As I read your writings, and we've heard you today, it doesn't sound to me, at least, like you're distinguishing. It sounds to me like you are saying the Western consensus really has two parts. One, a militarized approach to problem solving, but then secondly, the state-centric nature of the international development community. And you almost you seem to portray these two as kind of wedded at the hip and really essentially working together. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems is that actually the military campaign seems to have proceeded entirely independently of what was happening politically in Afghanistan. The two weren't really together. I think that there were problems with both. I think that in terms of our political engagement, I mean, I've discussed this in detail in my book. I start off with the emergency lawyer Jirga in 2002, where I was an election monitor, and where despite some fairly democratic processes in the district level elections, before that Grand Council of Elders, we call it, the actual meeting itself ended up being a complete charade, where the U.S. ambassador at the time, Zalmay Khalilzad, and the UN essentially allowed a lot of the governors and strongmen to come into the meeting, where, supported by the National Security Directorate, they were enabled to intimidate a lot of democratically elected candidates into voting the way that they wanted. So I feel that, yes, there have been many elements of the political process that have not been clear to people here in the US and back in Europe who've been funding this Afghan adventure, that we've all believed that it was for the rights of women and for democracy. But because there was no rule of law at the outset, this wasn't supported or taken seriously. Democracy had no chance of taking hold. But I evolved my own feelings on this because I was somewhat of a naive idealist perhaps at the beginning. I felt that there was really a chance for a kind of Western-style democracy. But the more time I spent, and particularly as I went to Jalalabad and spent time in these tribal areas in the east, I began to realize that a Western-style democracy wasn't appropriate at all in a country which is largely rural and is still predominantly rural. Most people live in rural areas, although there, of course, is a very vocal population in the center and cities who would quite like this. But so yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a long answer there.
No, these are hard questions. We've read a lot about the inability of the U.S. military in particular to understand the political dynamics with which it's dealing, probably more in the Iraq literature than the Afghan literature. But that's pretty well documented. We haven't seen quite as much on the centralized nature of the international development community. Can you expand? Why? Why are people with degrees in development who come from these quite respectable NGOs in your account kind of complicit in this non-political understanding of Afghanistan?
I think that every intervention, every country context is different. And one of the things that one of the Ursula brothers said to me is, you cannot apply the lessons of Bosnia to Afghanistan. You have to understand every different country in its context. And my feeling, and in fact, something that I explored through the book, but also in this paper that I did on state building in Afghanistan, is that the West has been predominantly concerned with building the kind of society, the kind of state, i.e. the sort of Westphalian nation-state model that it is familiar with, that we believe works. But we are kind of failing to take account of the fact that our societies have evolved over hundreds of years, and we are dealing with a tribal society, as I keep saying. And there is definitely a tension within Afghanistan, between Afghans, but also, I think, in the international community between those kind of modernizers and those traditionalists. And what I found was quite a lot of the modernizers, and particularly amongst them Afghans, tended to be people who were in the Afghan diaspora, who'd been living in the West, who had been educated in the West, working in the West, and were coming back to Afghanistan, maybe hadn't been there during the 1980s, and wanted to sort of impose their sort of ideal of this nation state onto that society. And it was just, they weren't really able to take those people in these remote rural communities with them on that.
You talked about the ANSF strategy, the Afghan National Security Force strategy, and you were quite dismissive of it, but moved very quickly through it. Could you unpack that a little bit? What's wrong with ISAF's approach to ANSF development, and why do you think that strategy is ultimately not going to work?
I think there's so much focus on this ANSF, this Afghan National Security Forces, how we're going to transition out by just handing over to these guys. And I feel that there's little understanding of just how flimsy this structure is. That, I mean, not only is it still predominantly perceived to be dominated by the Tajiks and by people from the north, with not enough Pashtun representation, for example, in the National Army, but that Afghans, I feel, they're very fearful about what's going to happen when the West pulls out, and that somehow that they're not going to be able to sustain this. I mean, we have to understand that there are forces both within the country and certainly in surrounding countries in the region that are going to predicate against this Afghan national security forces bolster to President Karzai. Of course, Pakistan, Iran, we've got all these countries around who are sort of adding fuel to that fire. But I feel that also there seems to be a kind of lacking, there's not enough legitimacy in the government itself, I believe, to prop itself up and through these forces. And I understand that the government of President Najibullah managed to survive 3 years after the pullout of the Soviets. And I've met Afghans who've told me that they came back from living abroad just to join the army in order to support President Najibullah and keep him in power. And I believe that that's because they were kind of pro this idea of what the Soviets had done and the modernization and so on. But with the Karzai government, the lack of with the amount of corruption, the difficulties with impunity, with the unpopular strongmen who have been dominating the setup since 2001 and 2002, where they were legitimized by the international community at the Loya Jirga, I believe that the government doesn't have the popularity to sort of start drawing Afghans back from the diaspora to actually prop it up with the army.
Okay. As we both know, there's extensive literature, both popular and academic, on issues of democracy in multi-ethnic societies, how difficult that is to set up, on the very real problems of aid dependency, particularly in a country that doesn't have a very large GDP, on the contested nature of non-state spaces, which you've referred to here. Again, I guess I'm re-asking the same question. I'm going to try to draw you out. The people who are working these issues are not uneducated. They have public policy and law degrees from very prestigious places. Presumably, they've been exposed to some of this literature. Why, in your opinion, do we have this theory-practice gap? We know these practices aren't going to work, and yet we continue to implement them.
I still believe that although a lot of the people are very educated who are involved, who may be civilian advisors in these PRTs, I think the model is predominantly a sort of external-led state-building process, and it's predominantly the West trying to put its vision of how things can develop onto Afghanistan. And recently, I was doing a presentation with another author who's just written a book on Afghanistan, and she'd said that she was horrified when someone from the State Department talked about Afghanistan as being a sort of tablet. He's talking about a Roman tablet of wax where they used to scroll their kind of maths for the buying things in the market. But she said that this State Department employee had actually said Afghanistan's great because we're just starting from scratch, as though there's nothing there for the West or for these Western interveners, these Western kind of state builders to deal with, as though because we don't understand the nature of this complex tribal society, we're assuming that it doesn't exist. So we don't deal with it, we don't engage with it. We come, we bring our opinions and our ideals, and we implement them largely, I think, also through the military, or, certainly this is the perception in Afghanistan that a lot is being done through military, through armed men. And that we ignore what has traditionally existed there because it's either too complex for us to understand or because we don't understand the languages and so on. And I think that's a huge problem.
Do you think that part of the problem is the people who are implementing this? When you get military officers who live on a Weberian concept of the state and the military having a monopoly on the legitimate use of armed force, and couple them with aid workers who largely come from Washington and Brussels, the center of pulling power to the center, is that part of the problem? Do they just naturally want to bring power to a capital?
I think the problem is definitely the time span and the impatience, particularly that not just the US but NATO has, that they have spent so much money in Afghanistan, they've been there for a decade, they want to get out. And they want to see quick results. But the problem is this has been the case from the beginning. They've wanted to see quick results. They haven't looked upon this in the medium to long term. They've wanted to stage elections despite the fact there was no rule of law, so they couldn't ever be proper elections. And these elections seem to have been staged more for the appeasement of the domestic populations in the US and in Europe than their sort of real applicability to the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. And I think, secondly, that yes, the military has definitely predominated in this, what you call a sort of 3D triangle of defense, diplomacy, and development. The military has dominated and has been able to gradually militarize aid. And this is certainly the case since I was first there in Kandahar during the Taliban, where we could really travel in the countryside, we could travel anywhere in a very secure environment, but it was very important that we didn't travel with guns or armed men in our vehicles, because that was considered inducing yourself to become a target. That's all changed now, and I've had Afghans tell me, well, the UN what do they think they're doing? They're traveling on American helicopters, and they are becoming far too much associated with one side in the conflict. So I think, yes, that's definitely a militarization of the aid and development sector is a big problem and very confusing for the Afghans.
How much does this theory of development that you bring up rely on having the right local leader? Or to rephrase, once Abdul Haq was killed, did this plan effectively die with him? Was there an opportunity to implement this in early 2002, even after his death, or was that just no longer politically practical with him no longer there to hold it together?
I think it's partly that he was definitely a very credible leader. He was very well known for bringing different sides together and building consensus and having people talk. But I think the other problem was definitely when the bombing campaign started and things changed, and the Northern Alliance were enabled to bomb through Taliban front lines and to flow into Kabul and take the key power ministries. So from that time, it was quite difficult for the West to reverse the mistakes that it had made, and this was definitely something he'd foreseen. I remember people in the British Embassy in January 2002 saying that Sayyaf had his rockets aimed at Kabul and from Pagman, and how are they going to roll this back and tell him to sort of kind of back off, and that this was basically impossible for them. So these guys, these strongmen, have been in the driving seat since the Western military campaign, and since they were able to take those ministries, take the security apparatus in Kabul and the various army units, and then again this was underscored by the legitimization that they were given politically by the West at the emergency Loya Jirga, which I had attended. And in fact, just to illustrate, on the eve of the Loya Jirga, which took place in the Polytechnic in Kabul in June 2002, I remember the UN had flown in something like 1,200 candidates from around the country. And these warlords suddenly arrived. They literally crashed through the ISAF cordons with their big cars and their bodyguards and their arms, which was strictly banned on the site. And I remember some of them came out of their cars and went towards a tented area. Some of the women who'd been elected were basically saying to them, "What are you doing here? Why are you here? You're the people who destroyed our country. Go away." And there was a real belief that they weren't going to be able to take part in the state building process, that their time had finished. They'd been in exile during the Taliban. And I felt that Afghans really thought that the West was going to somehow support them in this transition to democracy and women's rights, although I think the women's issue is very nuanced. But unfortunately, that's not what happened.
You've emphasized the importance of local knowledge, so if you want to defer on this next question, I'll let you. But as you sit and listen to your presentation, you can't help but think of Libya.
Yeah.
A very similar phenomenon, use of air power, lots of bombing, the centralizing of power in Tripoli, although there's some emphasis, the original rebels in Benghazi. What are your specific thoughts on Libya, given your research for this book?
I mean, I was actually pro the intervention in Libya because I think it was clear that Gaddafi was threatening those people in Benghazi. However, I'd have to say that every intervention is different. And in Afghanistan, I mean, Libya seems to be quite an opaque country. I mean, I'm no expert of North Africa, but there were people, particularly people here in Washington, D.C., and people in London who really should have known who the players were on the ground in Afghanistan, having had this engagement with that country during the 1980s, during the war against the Soviets. So just that point aside, I think we have to be careful with Libya not to, again, impose our idea of the westernized style democracy, that we have to step back and allow them, if they want Sharia law, to sort that out for themselves. I mean, obviously, the West has engaged and has allowed one group to predominate, there is a danger of a civil war there. But I think I get concerned when I hear reports on the radio of, gosh, everyone's up in arms because the Libyans are going to have Sharia law. And I think, there's a great danger of making that mistake if we interfere too much in that.
For our last little conversation here before we go to the audience, if you could just re-summarize then what you think are the key lessons going forward. What do policymakers need to think about in these states that, whether because of external intervention or because of internal causes, are going through some form of regime change, will have to go through a post-authoritarian rule transition. What do we take forward?
I think what we have to take forward is we have to think long-term in these places. You just can't go in and do the quick fix, the quick bombing, and then get out. There was a real assumption, I think, when the Taliban fell that everyone could pat themselves on the back and move on to Iraq. You have to think long-term. I think we have to really look away from the military lens. We have to start looking at these societies in their whole and look from the bottom up instead of trying to impose from top down our vision primarily through a bombing campaign. I think in Afghanistan it would have been actually far more effective if we'd had this process of transitional justice and rounded up some of these guys, or at least not allowed them to shape the outcome of the state and to retreat back to their fiefdoms after being in exile during the Taliban, and allow them to then sort of reassume control in those fiefdoms and then contribute to this crisis of impunity, which is what it's become. So I think, yes, less military domination, much longer term, and a great necessity to start understanding, to look at the academics who write more about these ideas of customary governance, traditional legitimacy, hybridized governance mechanisms. And this is more the sort of Shura, the Jirga process, to understand how these can contribute to stability. And this is something I've touched upon again, I've repeated again, this article I wrote for the Review of the Red Cross, which is a special edition on Afghanistan. It's called Conflict in Afghanistan. You can find it on the internet if you just Google ICRC and my name. Because I think this is a really fascinating area that has been so ignored in the last 10 years. And I think this is the future, that we have to really look much more deeply and not to try to dominate, but to work more with what is there.
Great, thank you. At this time, we'll turn to audience questions. When I call on you, please state your name and your affiliation after the microphone. You have a microphone? All right, wait for the microphone. Please state your name and affiliation, and then please ask Ms. Edwards your question. I ask that it be a question. You're entitled to a sentence or two of setup, but we don't have time for 30 seconds of your own personal political views on something. And we'll start in the back here in the blue shirt, right next to where the microphone is.
My name is Alexei Sapchenko, and I'm representing here myself. My question is very simple. In case we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan, would the option of dividing Afghanistan in two parts, meaning northern part and Pashtunistan, would it be a viable option at all? Thank you.
Are you taking a few?
Go ahead.
I think that's a bit of a sort of, this was an idea, I think it was mooted about a year ago in Foreign Affairs magazine. I don't think that this is a solution, really. I mean, you've still got this problem of the Pashtunistan issue and the Durand line with Pakistan, and I think that is the real root of the problem, rather than a difficulty so much between the Tajiks and the Pashtuns. I think Pakistan is the more significant problem there, and this the issue of the Durand line, which hasn't been resolved.
Next to the door here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edward, for the lecture. My question is about...
I'm sorry, your name?
Oh, my name is Saeed. I'm a student at Georgetown University and also working at the embassy. My question is about Akani. I mean, like, since Akani and Abdullah had such a great relationships, and probably Abdullah was the one who could bring Akani to the table of negotiations. now that he's gone and Akani has basically taken a completely separate sides against the government and also against the foreign invasion of Afghanistan, do you think we should kill or capture Akani or maybe talk to him?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the kill and capture scheme, again, focusing on numbers killed rather than bringing people to the negotiating table, it's, I mean, personally, I feel that that's not the way ahead. Of course, Haqqani, we're now talking about his son, Sirajuddin, and the younger generation who are much more extremist and difficult to engage with. And I think this is part of the problem of the last 10 years, where things have become, it's like entropy law. Things have just become way more complicated. The older generation were not brought up in refugee camps necessarily, and were not a generation who'd only known war throughout their lives, and had more of that tradition of coming together and consensus and talking. Personally, I think that you know, even if you kill and capture Sirajuddin Haqqani, I would imagine that there are 50 more Haqqanis out there who are going to fill his shoes. So I really think we have to change our approach. I don't believe that the kill or capture is the way ahead. I think it creates more anger. It creates more extremists. I've heard from people on the ground in that area in Waziristan, particularly and Paktia, that the younger generation of commanders, you know, when Westerners approached them, I mean, previously, of course, there was a huge amount of hospitality, and some of the journalists in the 80s who spent time with the Haqqanis, who have gone back now, who say that, you know, the younger generation just don't even want to be in the same room, that there's so much anger now. So I don't agree with this sort of policy of attrition. I think we have to think our way around this more intelligently.
Right here, in the brown leather.
Hi, I'm Taylor Johnson from the Institute for the Study of War. You talked a little bit about Massoud today. I was hoping to ask you about that. So Massoud was known for holding this band of these northern commanders together, a very charismatic leader. Would the Hawk Plan have still been feasible after he was assassinated shortly before 9/11? Thanks.
Of course, that's the $61,000 question. And also, would Massoud have kept to his word that he had given in Dushanbe in the summer of 2001? At this meeting that was recorded by Ambassador Peter Thompson, one of your State Department people, in his book, and also by James Ritchie, who was also present. And I think the two of them had disappeared and left Abdul Haq and Massoud to talk together that evening. And I heard from them that Massoud had given his word that he would buy in with this plan and that he would accept the return of the king, despite the fact that the king hadn't always been a popular figure with people in the northeast. Would things have changed? I think what made things less feasible was, again, the bombing campaign, which, again, handed those ministries to Fahim, who stepped into Massoud's boots, essentially. And Fahim was a very different animal. But I think possibly without that bombing campaign, and if the Pashtuns had been able to reach Kabul, if Abdul Haq had been able to reach Kabul, and be able to engage those commanders, that not just in the 3 Division in Kabul, but also in Hezarat, Ghazni, Gardez, and even over in Kandahar with Mullah Malang's people, that I think things would have been very different. So yeah, again, it comes back to how we just handed so much of the power to the Northern Alliance through the bombing, and that just turned the tables and made it difficult to go back from those power seekers, essentially.
In the very back.
My name is Syed. I am an Afghan journalist from Kandahar, and my English is not good. I have 2 questions, and I hope I am able to you understand my English. As you also said that you also worked in Kandahar, and I also worked with the Western propaganda media. I also worked with the UNAMA there. You mentioned that King was not popular or the Northern Alliance and as well as U.S. did not want it. In Pashto, we have a proverb that I never saw a stepmother kinder than my real mother. Most of the Western writers who write about us, and they usually just take this issue of our ethnic division. And usually everywhere there is ethnic divisions in every part of the world, but still it has not existed the way Western exaggerate about it. My question is, when the king was, I was part of the UNAMA in Kandahar, there were surveys in all over Afghanistan. He was very popular. Nobody could win from it. And Ambassador Zulmay Khalilzad, we covered this issue, that he forced him not to be candidate for Loya Jargah. This one question, why the West and the United States did not want him to be candidate? My second question is, of course, do you think, many people think the United States will declare this war as a war because it's a shameful defeat. So do you also agree that they will declare it as a victory? Thanks.
I think it's going to be difficult for them to declare it as a victory. I think probably they're going to shift the goalposts when they leave and just say that it's a stable country and that they're able to leave, handing over to Afghan National Security Forces. Why didn't they want the king? I've talked to various people about this. I was also there at the Loya Jirga when the king arrived, and he went onto the podium to give his speech after having been away several decades from Afghanistan, and the microphone was cut off, and he wasn't able to speak to his people. And the same thing had happened when he came off the plane from Rome. The microphone mysteriously cut off, and he wasn't able to speak. And the way the king was treated, I think, was shameful by the West. I think this was largely because, Francesc Vendrell, who I used to work for, who had been the head of UNAMA, UNSMA, as it was, prior to 9/11, who was actually, I think, quite keen on the return of the king. He said that the US never wanted the king to take a role. And I would imagine that this also has to do with the fact that those Tajik factions, the Northern Alliance, after the bombing campaign, also didn't want the return of the king. I think that there's been quite a lot of antipathy towards the king by some of those small minorities of the northeast, and particularly the Panjshir. And I would imagine that this relates to feeling threatened by his popularity, because he certainly seemed to be seen as a very popular symbolic figure, or someone who had presided over 40 years of peace and relative stability in Afghanistan until he was deposed in 1973. I hope that answers the question.
Afghanistan several times, but I don't know nearly enough about it. Quick question: is Karzai perceived as a Western plant or agent? You may have covered this already. Sorry if you did. And is the corruption level in Kabul widely known all over the country? We all hear about it all the time. Is it a factor in the political debate? And is Karzai considered legitimate Afghan leader?
I've dealt in my book with Karzai and how he came to be where he is today, and at what stage there might have been some kind of agreement with the Bush administration. Karzai, I think, certainly does not appear from conversations I've had with people to have been someone of any great standing. Certainly not to the extent of Abdul Haq. Abdul Haq, of course, was a national figure who's very well known for his bravery and his strategic cleverness during the 1980s in his operations. Karzai was basically pretty junior at that stage. I think that certainly possibly the CIA and people here in the Bush administration wanted someone that they felt would be on message. Abdul Haq was well known to be quite outspoken, quite critical during the 1980s and even thereafter, when he was writing letters to ambassadors and to leaders in Western countries, warning them about the camps that were being built along the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, the arrival of the Arab fighters, the proliferation of fake IDs. he made a noise about this, and he wasn't just prepared to do what he was told and shut up. And I do feel that's partly, and of course, the undermining of him in terms of guys in the CIA saying Abdul Haq has baggage, Abdul Haq is not capable, Abdul Haq is just Hollywood hack because he likes speaking to the journalists. I mean, some of the guys that I interviewed in Britain who were trying to bring support for him through in our various intelligence agencies and in Whitehall in October and September 2001, some of these guys had traveled extensively in Afghanistan during the 1980s, and including Ken Guest, who's a very interesting character. He was a cameraman. He's covered all these wars throughout these several decades, written books about medieval warfare, and he's an ex-Marine in the British Army. And he discussed with me quite extensively what he felt was the demeaning of Abdul Haq by characters in the CIA in the mid-80s. And Ken, of course, was in country. He wasn't sitting in Islamabad. And he talked about, for example, the blowing of this munitions dump in Karga, a 7-story underground munitions dump of the Soviets, which Abdul Haq had blown with a single rocket, apparently, after 6 months of planning, and which the CIA station chief at the time refused to acknowledge that this was Abdul Haq. You know, he was saying, oh, all these commanders were claiming that they did it. That was enough for me. But, you know, really, I think that the CIA had a duty to really know who were the effective guys to be working with, because, you know, this was American money, American tax dollars, and Afghan blood. And I think that it was incumbent upon them to really know who were the most effective players, and I think they failed in that. And I think after 9/11, Ken, for example, cited to me how he'd been behind the camera filming a meeting with Hamid Gul of the ISI, former chief of the ISI, and no, he was actually filming this particular ex-CIA station chief, and he'd asked him casually if he could give him Hamid Gul's telephone number. And 10 years after this guy had left the theater, he was able to roll off Hamid Gul's phone number straight off his tongue after 9/11. And so Ken said this proved to me that he was still in regular contact with the ISI, and that, you know, basically it seemed like the CIA was still basically taking their direction from the ISI. And I think that that is really contributed to quite a large part of the problem we see today.
Corruption today, corruption level.
Yeah, corruption, I mean, definitely. Corruption, it took the West a long time to realize what was going on with the corruption. I mean, it was even very evident in 2004, 2005, and it was not acknowledged. I remember being in a meeting with donors, and at that stage I was working for the European Union office, and we had compiled various reports of drug hauls that were being intercepted by NATO, when there was possibly a call from a high level, and that these had to be then let go. This is just one example. Then, of course, there's the example of Shahpur, the land on the old British cantonment, being parceled up by Fahim and sold off or given away as sinecures to other ministers. But corruption seems to be reaching every level of society, and I think this is why somehow the Taliban have been able to gain traction, because during the Taliban it wasn't such a corrupt time at all. You know, I interviewed Haji Zair, who was in jail in Kandahar for a couple of years during the Taliban period, and his father, Haji Qadir, had sent $20,000 to him from the Panjshir Valley, and this was held by his captors. And I said, well, okay, they looked after your money, didn't they just steal it? And he was like, no, you know, every time I needed a packet of cigarettes, they'd give me the money and I'd send out to have the packet of cigarettes bought for me. He said they were simple but honest people. But I think now the corruption, it's very much in league with sort of international mafia, and it's very difficult to reverse now. Very, very difficult.
Right here.
My name is Li Yang, independent TV producers. I wonder what kind of policy or method or policy practice they have in order to develop potential leaders what I mean is capable leaders for the best interest of the public interest, from local to national, not just on the top. And the second is how do they improve the transparency or accountability? Again, from local to national.
I think, well, the problem of leadership, it's, largely I think the problem for Karzai has been that he wasn't such a national figure. He didn't have a political party or much military support behind him of his own. And so he's essentially almost had to barter sinecures in order to remain in power. He's had to barter positions, government positions, police chief positions, governor positions in the regions to these strong men in order to buy their support in the short term. And these are not the kind of people that you necessarily make the best leaders, either on a local level or on a national level. But the West has actually contributed to that problem, because where, for example, we have PRTs or military bases in the regions, the primary objective of a lot of the base commanders has been force protection of their soldiers. So where he's put in place these guys who are not necessarily the best leaders, we've just, in a way, we've solidified their power, we've bolstered their power by working with them to protect routes, to protect or to hire land or to use their militia forces. So I think that's one part of the problem. Transparency. Again, I think while you have this situation of impunity, it's very difficult to have any kind of decent institutions and any sort of transparency.
Thank you.
Thank you for interesting speech. And my name is Shoji Motoka from Johns Hopkins Science, and I'm former Kabul bureau chief of Japanese public television NHK. And once our coverage team visited the hospital in the Nangarhar area before, and that hospital was built by the U.S. PRT team recently. And we found very little local people are using that hospital. We asked a question, why you don't use this hospital? One reason is, this is far from the residential area. The other reason is, they are afraid of Taliban, because visiting such kind of a US-built facility is regarded as a kind of a supporter for USA. They don't want to be labeled as a US-oriented to local people. So, but of course, they need this kind of a facility. They need a hospital, but they don't want a U.S.-built hospital. So, how can you, solve this kind of, problem? To build this country better. Thank you very much.
Where was the hospital? Nangarhar. Okay. Yeah. This is a very nice example, exactly, of the problem of the militarization of aid and the aid industry, and how this has all coalesced together over the last decade. I believe we fail to understand the political consequences for local people of when we have Western military coming in, and it's not just applied to hospitals, but schools and courthouses and so on, that we fail to understand that it's not so easy if Western troops have built one of these structures that local people can immediately use it, that there could be reprisals against them by insurgent groups. Another factor, of course, is the cost. It's far more expensive to have Western troops building these things than, for example, some of the NGOs or humanitarian agencies who were working in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, who had the expertise. My husband works at the ICRC, and he was quite surprised when he went to Herat and he was talking to the Italian PRT about the projects that they were doing. They were doing some water supply projects, and they told him what their budget was, and it was a very big budget, and he was very surprised. And he said, he told me that they previously would have done that for a fraction of the price. So, it's inefficient to have the military building hospitals and schools and doing water supply projects and so on, because, of course, you have to pay for each soldier that does it rather than aid workers. And, of course, by comparison or by contrast with the types of projects that I was involved with before 9/11 when I worked for UN Habitat in Kandahar. At that stage, the UN and UNDP had developed this mode of delivering development projects, which was very community-based. It was very bottom-up. It was all about the community being involved in designing the projects, and there was actually even a sort of formula, an algebraic formula for how to select beneficiaries of the projects. So at that stage, there had been a 3-year drought. Hundreds of thousands of people had been pushed off their land or had to leave their land because their crops had failed and they had sold all their assets. And there were refugee camps or IDP camps in Kandahar and Herat. And our projects were aimed at the most vulnerable people in the community, so widows and so on. But the community would select who those beneficiaries were. We weren't identifying them. The community were very much engaged in that. And because of this, and in fact, one particular project I was working on, drought relief project, where we were literally having very vulnerable men shoveling shit out of the alleys between the streets, taking them to the kind of street corner, and then you'd have a municipal vehicle coming and picking it up, and then a dump truck. These projects were so popular, even under the Taliban, that people were, after the UN funding ceased, were going to fund them with their Islamic taxes. And so this is, the difference between the sort of top-down and the bottom-up development projects, which I think we need to rethink completely.
The blue suit here on the aisle.
I'm Chris May. I'm here as an independent figure. I'm a deeply worried grandfather about the course of so many things going on, and particularly about Afghanistan. If President Obama were to ask for your advice as to what to do now in terms of both the U.S. interests and the interests of the Afghans, what would you suggest to him?
That's the $100,000 question in Washington in the next year, I think, as they run up to the elections. As I've said, part of the reason I wrote the book was because I felt that there was a window of opportunity after 9/11 that if we didn't recognize and grasp was going to slip away forever. And Abdul Haq essentially predicted, even in 1992, the chaos that we see today in Afghanistan. He talked about if Mujahideen elements take control in Afghanistan, there will be war forever. And we Afghans will have to beg from the international community for the rest of our lives for support, for aid, and so on. There is no easy solution in Afghanistan. We have got ourselves into such a mess there. We have wasted so much money there. We have ignored the advice of the people who knew. The people, unfortunately, I think a lot of this went back to the desire for a fireworks display after 9/11, the appeasement of the population here in the US because of the anger of the 9/11 attacks. But you just cannot deal with a failed state like that. You just can't. We have to be more intelligent about the way that we approach these countries. And I think primarily that involves quitting this obsession with military action, with drones, with bombs, with fireworks displays. I think we have to be grown up, and we have to talk to people, and we have to know who, we have to disaggregate the kind of characters that we really need to build these societies in the long term. And one of the brothers of this family that I stayed with, Abdul Haq's, one of his 7 brothers, who was trying to resurrect Ashura in Jalalabad after the death of Abdul Haq and then Haji Qadir. He said to me, part of the problem is that the PRTs are, even though they're trying to work a bit more with the elders in these regions, they are paying these people. And this doesn't work in Afghan society, that traditionally people would do this on a voluntary basis, and that you're going to attract the best types of people, those who really want to help their communities. If you don't pay them, if you start paying them, you are immediately introducing an element of corruption, and you're going to attract more the kind of strongmen types. So I think, long term, less military, and really understand who the players are on the ground.
Did we learn nothing from Vietnam?
I don't know. It doesn't seem like we've learnt a lot.
In fairness, I think that was the $100 billion question, not the $100,000 question. In the brown in the back?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. I'm Bob Dreyfus with The Nation magazine. So if Pakistan wants to impose its will on Afghanistan, which seems to have been the theme of the past 3 decades, and the United States is basically beginning to close the door on our role there sometime in the next few years. Doesn't that mean that Pakistan basically gets to do what it wants to? They tried to impose their 7-party group several times since the 1980s and in various forms. The Indians, I mean, it may be too strong to argue that Massoud was a stooge of the Indians, but he was certainly an ally of theirs and armed and died in one of their hospitals. So what do we do about the India-Pakistan proxy war, especially because most of the tribal structures that existed, if they ever existed in the 70s under the king and so on, have been decimated and destroyed, and people have been assassinated by the hundreds and hundreds of elders, by the insurgents and others. So I don't know if there's any pieces to put back together there anymore.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this announcement a couple of weeks ago that this cooperation agreement between India and Afghanistan, I think, was very provocative to Pakistan. This is, again, a huge factor that India and Pakistan might continue to fight their proxy war using Afghanistan as a sort of, well, I mean, Pakistan always talking about wanting to essentially have more influence in Afghanistan for strategic depth reasons against India. I think we need to get back to the heart of the problem between India and Pakistan. And that might mean resolving, I mean, going back to looking at the Kashmir dispute. Because otherwise, I don't really see how this can be resolved. I think, I mean, obviously Pakistan is becoming a lot less stable. Things have, you know, this to me, I mean, the nuclear issue there is very serious. The issue of more and more extremists. But, you know, since 9/11, there has been investment in the military side by the US with the Pakistani government, but not in education. And I think this is, you know, it's got to come back to education, that we have to look long term, and we have to help these people to educate their populations. But we also perhaps need to apply travel sanctions on some of these figures, some of these so-called rogue ISI. I don't know how rogue they are or how much they represent the Pakistani state. But this is a very intractable problem that you've highlighted. And on the tribal issue, I think, yes, it's very difficult now that so many of these tribal leaders have been assassinated and assassinated by all sides, assassinated by Hekmatyar, assassinated by the communists or the Soviets, by the Taliban. But I still believe that Afghans, particularly in the south, in that southern Pashtun belt, which is our main focus of the insurgency, I still believe that they like to work with these structures, that they prefer this approach to this idea of this top-down approach that we seem to have, of this capacity building, this extension of central government into the regions. I think we do need to start from ground level up, and we shouldn't negate that tribal side of the equation.
Just on Pakistan and education, I would just point out there's a very interesting recent paper by Christine Fair out of Georgetown and Jake Shapiro, I think he's at Princeton now, that points out that among more educated Pakistanis, there's higher support for armed insurgent groups than there is among the lower classes. So higher education, it's more complex than just educating people. I thought I saw another hand. Any more questions? Going on, yes.
I'm loud. Like I have a loud voice.
Please take the mic anyway. We need
Oh,
it for
okay.
people who are not here.
Just a correction. Commander Masood was died on the spot, and he did not die in an Indian hospital, and he was pronounced dead on the spot. And also another thing, I think once we are kind of like exacerbating the ethnic kind of like divisions and the conflicts between the Tajiks and the Pashtuns, I think it's a little unfair, because what's happening with assassination, for example, this chain assassination that's happening, it is even the Taliban are right now confused who is doing it. For example, like I have never heard or even read about it that a Tajik group coordinated an assassination of a Pashtun leader, or a Pashtun leader coordinated an assassination of.
Question?
I'm just asking about the question that how we can kind of like put the pressure more into where these kind of like the directions are coming from. For example, if we continue kind of like talk, bring, for example, those who are kind of associated with the ISI, but we are just trying to bring them to the table of negotiations, but they are trying not to if their boss doesn't tell them to do so. And how we can kind of like convince them rather than kind of saying that, rather than blaming the Panjshiris or the Tajiks that, for example, just holding all the positions, as we can tell that the current government in Afghanistan is not fully basically administered and run by the Tajik people. And also with the military, it's 43% of the military is the Pashtuns. It's not the Tajiks. It's very mixed kind of in terms of ethnic composition.
All right. I think that just despite his quoting of figures as to what ethnic group is what, I mean, I think the question is, do we put too much stock in he's a Tajik, he's a Hazara, he's a Pashtun?
I think I understand where you're coming from on that, but there was definitely a civil war going on before 9/11 in Afghanistan, and I was there, and I remember, for example, the staff in my office in Kandahar celebrating when the Taliban took the city of Talakan in the northeast. And I said to them, I was actually pretty shocked that my staff, who I thought were all these very educated people, that they all supported the Taliban. I'd assumed that they wouldn't. So when I asked them why they were so happy that they'd taken Talakan, they said, because we'll soon win the war, and that means we'll have 100% of the country, and then the Taliban will have to supply us with education and healthcare instead of fighting against the Tajiks. Yes, I mean, things are very complicated now, and I mean, I'm not sure that we even know who was responsible for killing Rabbani. Has that been resolved, that issue? But I would say that, yes, there's definitely, I mean, my experience of the first 5 years was that there was an antipathy and a feeling of alienation by the Pashtuns, that they didn't feel that they'd had fair representation in the political settlement in 2001 and 2002, that they apparently had been quite a lot of Pashtun leaders from the south who weren't able to attend the Bonn talks, a feeling that Brahimi had shut some of them out and not allowed them to participate, that they were somehow too much associated with the Taliban, the sort of black and white, good guys and bad guys issue. So I think the West was a bit too simplistic about that. And there was certainly a feeling amongst Tajiks that we should be rewarded because we've got rid of the Taliban. Whereas possibly amongst some of the Pashtuns, it was a little bit more nuanced, that some of them had joined the Taliban as a feeling of bringing stability, or joining a movement that was bringing stability to clear out the warlords and the warlordism of the mid-1990s. So, and I'm not sure about the figures on the army, but it depends on the rate of attrition, but certainly there has been a feeling for quite a long time that the army was quite heavily Tajik.
Great. If we can close then, I'd give you a final few minutes here to restate the thesis of your book, kind of bring us all, wrap this up together, and what are you saying, and why should policymakers care?
Okay, so I'm saying that we need to revisit history. We need to understand the opportunities that we lost and where we went wrong in order to move on. I've had people, even someone at the White House saying to me, well, who cares? I mean, we didn't quite say who cares, but he basically said, come on, we just want to know how to get out. But it's not an easy, quick fix. You have to know where we went wrong in order to move ahead. So my book is really a documentation of that, of what I witnessed over those years, the turning points that I felt where the West had really squandered opportunities and what was the outcome of those opportunities lost. But also what I felt was an internal solution, because we need to look for an internal solution in Afghanistan, although I think it's going to be pretty hard to find one. But I think it was an internal solution, and that it was pretty much reliant on, well, of course, not on foreign intervention, which is very unpopular, which brings people together against the foreigner, but one that was very much focused on this idea of legitimacy at a local level. And I think that this is something that we've really just completely not looked at in the last 10 years in this idea of this sort of very militarized and very technical approach to the war, this kinetic approach. And I think that we need to understand on the psychological level of the Afghans also how to deal with the situation, because it's a war of perception, as it's not just a kinetic situation that we're in. So, yeah, I leave it there for you.
Thank you very much. Again,
Thank you, Doug.
Ms. Edwards is the author of The Afghan Solution, the inside story of Abdul Haq, the CIA, and how Western hubris lost Afghanistan. We encourage you all to pick up a copy, which are available outside. Again, thank you for coming, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks.